Welcome to week 2. This week is primarily about boxing, but also about other sort of what we call fighting sports, MMA, martial arts, singular martial arts like judo, jiu-jitsu, karate. And, you might be able to put, I think you could put wrestling in this category as well. The reason I put it first, it's the first major sport we talk about and that I record a lecture about, is that it's one of the oldest sports. Sort of this pugilistic form, which is the word that we use. It's a sort of a fancy word that encapsulates sort of this one-on-one fighting type of competition. Pugilism, it's called Pugilism, is known to have been contested in the ancient Olympics in Greece 2,500 years ago. Both wrestling and boxing, sparring, have been depicted as occurring. It's been depicted in hieroglyphics and in other ancient cultures, and such as ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon, the Persian Empire, things of that nature. I mean, it's one of the more fundamental. Kid brothers, twin brothers. You see it with all forms of animals, kind of tussling with each other as a sort of a test of aggression, dominance, and other such things. This is a very famous photograph. If you've ever seen footage of this, it's not nearly as impressive as the photograph. This is Muhammad Ali when he defeated Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And he's actually just kind of dancing over him, kind of doing this. But it makes it look like he knocked him down and he's, flexing. That's kind of not what he's doing. But number one, it's a visually striking photograph. But number two, it plays into boxing's narrative of dominance and submission. Boxing is a very visceral sport. It's a sport of, I'm going to beat you down. Okay? Normally the type of thing that we would not sanction in society. And there's plenty of people that find boxing too much about power and dominance. And in fact, a lot of boxing films chart the territory because I think we understand that this is part of the human nature, that it's hard to flip on and off the aggression switch. And there's a film called Raging Bull, which is about Jake LaMotta. It's about a real figure who was still alive when the movie was made. And it really makes the point that the qualities that made him a good boxer, aggression, relentlessness, the need to physically best other people and to intimidate them, made him a terrible husband. Okay, and we certainly have seen a lot of boxers. Well, we see a lot of professional athletes with problem, but with this problem. But in boxing, the very things that will lead you to victory are the very things that you then must sublimate when you're in the rest of society. So it's a very kind of an interesting sport for that very reason. It's a sport that can be very intimate. I've never been to a boxing match, but those that have say that if you sit on the front row, expect to get sweat and in longer, more violent matches, blood. A fighter will get hit and sweat will go flying off, and it will go flying 10 feet, and it will get all over people in the front front rows. For heavyweight, for world championship bouts, they pack these big arenas, but usually it's contested in a smaller arenas where you're very, very close. You're close enough to see the expression on these people's face when they're getting hit. You're close enough to see their pain and understand their, what physically they're going through. And I guess that's part of the appeal. So just a little bit about the history of boxing. In the American context, it comes out more out of the European, the sort of the late modern European form of boxing, which was bare knuckle. It was called prize fighting because they fought for a prize, um, which could go for hundreds of rounds. Now, what it usually was standing way back and kind of circling around each other. And a round was as soon as a single punch was landed, you separated and maybe went and got a drink or something, and then came back. You didn't take that long between rounds. Now there were precedents. There were brawls that were more just pounding on each other until somebody goes down. Those wouldn't last that long. But these prize fights that were the sort of more formalized could last hours on end. They could last half the day because as soon as the punch landed, you took a little bit of a break. Okay, that and so when you read about something went like 97 rounds or something, you start to understand that it's not quite like 97 rounds in today's boxing, because in today's boxing, even with gloves, if it's 12 rounds, they're absolutely exhausted at the end of 12 rounds. So that was kind of the in the 1700s, 1800s, into the late 1800s. It was along these lines, but it started to be in the late 1800s or the late 19th century. Rules and weight classes began to become formalized. There was this push to have things more unified, to have things more codified, and to figure out who was the best, who was the champion. Because I think, as Gorn makes very, very clear, I was going to talk a little bit about Gorn later, but I'll just throw this point in so we'll spend less time on here later. Sporting was very much a localized affair up until a certain point. There weren't these big national communities that all supported the same person or even knew the same person. Sporting was just a very localized thing. If somebody became well known, it was only in a very limited area, and there just sort of was no national celebrities, only local celebrities. Well, as telegraph and communication technologies and newspapers and things like that, and as transportation technologies with the railroad going through in the 1850s, and particularly after the Civil War in the 1870s, with greater transportation and greater technology, particularly technologies of communication, and with photography in particular, you start seeing the growth of local celebrities into regional celebrities into even maybe a few national celebrities by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th century. And that was very interesting. And boxing was one of the first. I kind of go in. I don't go necessarily in a logical progression, but for the first couple weeks we talk about boxing, horse racing, and poker, and baseball. Those are the first. That's weeks 2, 3, and 4, because those are the oldest sports in America. Those are the oldest major sports. Those are the sports that came out of the 19th century. Okay, basketball was invented in the early 20th century. Football kind of evolved out of rugby, which goes back hundreds of years. But it wasn't really until actually football was contested a little bit before 1900, but it was really after 1900 that it came to maturity. Baseball came to maturity during the Civil War. Horse racing even before that. Boxing even before that. So weight classes. It's not fair for somebody who's 6'5" and weighs 250 pounds to fight somebody who's 5'7" and weighs 110 pounds. Okay, so how do we get around that? There's more than one champion. Okay, this is a smart marketing move as well. You can have what are called undercards. You have the fight before that. You have the big fight, but kind of before that, you have other several fights with different weight classes. Okay. Minimum weight with a maximum of 105 pounds. So if you're 99 pounds, you're in what's called a minimum weight. to heavyweight, which is everything 200 pounds and above. And there's a lot of weight classes in between there. There's bantamweight, which is obviously one of the smaller ones, flyweight, featherweight. Those are some of the then there's middleweight, cruiserweight. There's different weight classes. Also rules. Number one, as this became more formalized, they started thinking about safety a little bit and, wearing some sort of protective wrap on the hands. Well, of course, then some, smart people started putting lead in their hand and wrapping their hand to give themselves more power. And so you had to have people checking up on this, which eventually in the 20th century led to these accrediting bodies, the WBC and whatever. Actually, I think isn't the WBC a television channel? I can't remember, but there's these different sort of accrediting agencies that make sure that the rules are followed. Arrange for judges that can't be bought and corrupted and stuff like that. However, boxing has always been corruptible, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. One thing that is a key part of boxing is what's called the weigh-in, to weigh the fighters to make sure that they are both minimum weight or that they are both cruiserweight or bantamweight. And what would happen a long time ago is that if somebody was overweight, they would if you've ever been in a sauna, like a really hot sauna, like I was this last summer, I mean, I went into this thing and I can't remember what temperature it was. It was like 160 degrees or something. And, I just shut the door and immediately sweat's coming out of my pores. And then, I wish there had been a scale, because I did that for 5-10 minutes and then, went and jumped in the pool. And, actually, this was the summer before last. I wasn't being irresponsible during COVID. This was 2 summers ago. I wouldn't be surprised if I lost a couple of pounds just in sweat. Well, the boxers would do that, okay, right before the weigh-in, right before the fight, and then they'd be exhausted and dehydrated during the fight. So what happens now is you can crash, dehydrate. Because they do it 2 days before, a day or two before the fight, and then you can rehydrate so that you can be healthy again. So a lot of times boxers, when they enter the ring, are above fighting weight. It's just that when they weighed, they were below. Spectacle bouts started in the early 20th century, even earlier than that, but this is when it really starts to get popular, with huge amounts of marketing and gambling. You read about Jack Johnson. He was the first Black American heavyweight champion. There was a Canadian, a Black Canadian fighter who had won the title before him. But Jack Johnson was the first American Black boxing champion, and I believe the second American of African descent to win a world championship. The first was Major Marshall in cycling. I had to go over to France because he wasn't accepted in the United States. And Jack Johnson, I don't know if it mentioned with Jack Johnson, one of the things that they did that was very interesting, but he couldn't, because he was black and because of, racism was was very, very prevalent in that day. He had a hard time getting a fight and defending his so they wanted to have it in a foreign country, but, the United States, a lot of places wouldn't allow the fight to happen, but Americans were going to be the paying customers. So at one point, I believe it was in a sandbar in the middle of the Rio Grande River between Texas and Mexico, they went and created a stage and, put ropes around it and had a fight in the middle of the Rio Grande River. So yeah, Jack Johnson was an early Black athlete in American history. He also stood up for himself. He didn't care what other people had to say, and he was punished for it and actually put in jail. But thus begins the long history in the United States of race and sports creating this nexus, which creates these kind of contested moments, okay, culminating in a lot of social change, with like Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali and whatnot. But there has to be someone who's first. And yeah, even though I mentioned Major Marshall, the cyclist, it wasn't to quite the same level of national prominence as Jack Johnson was, because okay, a black American being better than white Americans at cycling for the white American mindset, for the racist white American mindset, okay, that might be bad enough. But boxing, which is physical domination, which is superiority, not just of physical strength, but of tactics and strategy, to have a black American who was just defeating all white comers, anyone that would come along, and challenge him, he'd beat pretty convincingly. That was very difficult on the mindset of a white America that was steeped in theories of racial superiority. Okay, so boxing was kind of at that crossroads in the early part of the 20th century. When, I don't know if you were at convocation today and were hearing about the president of Harvard being a eugenicist and being into eugenics. But that was a big thing, like at the early part of the 20th century. And eugenics is sort of manipulation of populations based on theories of racial supremacy, usually placing Northern Europeans at the very top. Basically the stuff that the Nazis did. Well, it was big in America in the early 1900s, and it was kind of difficult to say this with a straight face when Jack Johnson, the boxer, the African American boxer, was prevailing. So the first spectacle bouts were actually a couple were before Jack Johnson, but that even added to the spectacle because it added this element of race and ethnicity. Now, even before that, there was issues of ethnicity in boxing. One of the prior, I think his name was Jack Sullivan, in the late 19th century was Irish. Okay, and at that point, the Irish were very much a minority. They were very much racially oppressed, ethnically oppressed, I should say. And the fact that Jack Sullivan became a big celebrity and everyone loved him says two things. Number one, that society was beginning to accept the Irish as white, because at one point they were considered to be non-white almost. They were sort of like this they were a white minority in Europe, and that carried over to the United States. But the fact that Jack Johnson was reviled and jailed and Jack Sullivan was celebrated also suggests something else, which is that a white minority would be more easily incorporated into the American mainstream when it came to celebrating heroes. And we're going to talk a little bit later about Joe Louis and how he had to walk a very, very fine line. Spectacle bouts started in the early 20th century with huge amounts of marketing, these big build-ups, and manufactured controversy, although sometimes it didn't even have to be manufactured, and lots of gambling. And whenever there's gambling, there is corruption in sports. What they call it, taking a dive, throwing a game. I'm not sure which sport throwing a game can be linked to. I suppose baseball. Taking a dive is most definitely a boxing term, because you pretend to get hit and fall down in the third round, and a mobster that put down $1,000 that you would go down in the third round, makes $60,000 and he gives you $5,000. Well, if you're only standing, if you're going to make $2,000 if you win a fight and only get $500 if you lose a fight, hey, I'm gonna lose the fight on purpose in the round that the guy tells me to, and make 10 times as much as I would. You can see why that thought process would go through their minds. Some other aspects of history, these gambling associations were hard for it to overcome, and so um, it's not just weighted gloves and throwing fights. They would also sometimes put like, um, there's low level cheating, rubbing yourself up with Vaseline. So okay, that's not that bad. But sometimes people would put cayenne pepper, like make a paste out of cayenne pepper and just sort of, and so when you hit somebody in the eye, they start blinking. They can't see. It makes it easier. Makes it easier to hit them again. There have even been some cases where people would put nails and have it just so that the nail couldn't be seen. It's about this far under the surface, but then when you hit somebody, it just barely comes out and scratches them a little bit. Okay. There's different types of boxers, different styles. There's the boxer who's more technical, more defensive and counterpunch. There's the brawler, who, big, not a lot of technique, sort of the opposite of the boxer. The boxer's not going to knock you out right away. The boxer's going to wear you down, probably win on points from the judges. The brawler is going to knock you out in the first round or two because beyond that, he'll be too tired. He or she. Boxing is contested by women as well. The swarmer is one who tries to get all over you. Just tries to come in close because they have the advantage at uppercuts. They're usually maybe shorter. They don't have as long a reach, which means their arm isn't as long. Usually, if somebody has a 60-inch reach versus a 54-inch reach, whoever has the longer reach is going to be able to hit from further away. They have the advantage. Well, a swarmer takes that away from you. So it's kind of like the brawler. The counterpuncher, who's mostly defensive, relies on speed to duck yours and then get you back. And then the southpaw, and I have no idea why it's called southpaw. I guess it's paw because it's your hand and south as opposed to north. But a southpaw is just a left-handed fighter. A southpaw technically could be a boxer, brawler, swarmer, or counterpuncher. But it's historically more difficult for boxers, for fighters to compete against southpaws because most of the people they spar with are right-handed. And in fact, whenever, particularly like a champion will have a southpaw coming up as an opponent, they will hire another southpaw to come in and train with them just so they can get used to everything being in reverse. There's even different types of punches. There's a jab. I'm right-handed, so let's see if I can do this. I have my right hand back because that's, you're going to have more power if your hand is back because you reach back and then swing. But so my left hand is forward if I'm a boxer and I'm right-handed, which I am. So what you do is you jab. Okay, with your weak hand, okay? And these boxers, work out their weak hand arm, obviously, but, I'm not trying to knock you out, but, I'm trying to get you to go back a little bit. I'm trying to establish a little rhythm, and then do something like that. It's the jabs are to set up what's called a combination where you do several things at once. But it's about timing. It's about kind of annoying your opposition. And actually, if you a bunch of tiny little jolts to the chin are going to wear down a boxer. That's what a jab is basically. There's an overhand or a cross, which is more like this. You're coming even, almost down, sort of like this. You can look this stuff up on the internet. I'm not a very good actor like this. It's called like a right cross or a left cross. It's an overhand. There's a hook, which is more around. You're not coming straight across. You're coming. It's more of a power punch, really. The overhand cross is more quick. The hook has more power, but it takes longer. And then there's the uppercut, which is the really power punch, but it's hard to land because it's when you get close up enough and you come straight up and you try to catch him right under the chin. Okay? It's hard to land because you have to be pretty close. and all boxers are trained to avoid, because that's usually the one that will knock you out in one, just turn your lights out just like that. Um, and you've no doubt watched the clips of all these fighters that we'll be talking about. So, in matches, so you've no doubt seen examples of these. What is the WBC? Oh, I guess the WB it's the WB that's the TV show. Okay, the TV channel. So boxing is run by several organizations: the International Boxing Federation, the World Boxing Association. There's just these different acronyms. They all just kind of created themselves into existence and somewhere gained legitimacy. And so what happens is occasionally, and see, this is good for the sport. This is good for PR, marketing, is that sometimes, particularly when a champion will retire, all of a sudden, all these belts are up and they disperse, because the IBF says, we want to put these two guys together. And the WBA says, no, we want to put these two together. And all of a sudden you have like 3 world champions, and they call them disputed world champions. Okay? So then what starts to happen is, okay, the IBF champ then meets the WBA champ, and they fight. And so the belts start to get consolidated. And they're called unification bouts. And, boxing's not nearly as big as it used to be. I mean, it really hasn't been since Mike Tyson, I would say, and Evander Holyfield. And part of it, I think, is American snobbery, that there's no it was a Ukrainian that dominated the sport for 15 or for 12 years or whatever. So we're just not as interested because it's not American. But I also think that MMA, we'll talk a little bit about that, has taken away market share. But for essentially 100 years, these unification, it gave people a narrative to follow. This person is gone. So what's going to happen? Which of these young fighters is going to consolidate all the belts in one? Another aspect of boxing is there's 2 cornermen, there's multiple cornermen. There's 2 trainers and a cut man. What's the cut man's job? Well, he's kind of a medic. And the reason he's called a cut man is one of the most common injuries in boxing is that your eye swells shut. Okay, you get blood coming in, and it gets to the point where it forces the eye shut. And you can Google boxer closed eye or something like that, and you'll see these like almost comical things. And what it is in there is blood. And so what they do is they take a razor blade and cut it, okay? And they have to be very careful. Obviously, that's why it's called a cut man, okay? And they have to get you ready to go. And they do it with, when you get pummeled, you're actually getting, even though it's a glove, they're actually getting cut by the ridges in your bones. Your opponent is. Because these guys are hitting with such strength that even with that big puffy glove, it compresses down to where it's essentially the glove is contoured over the, and just for a microsecond, over their fist, and they're getting almost cut by ridges on their knuckles and stuff like that. It's crazy. So these guys get cut. They get cut on their body, they get cut on their face. And if you bleed too much, they may stop the fight. So, every 3 rounds, every 3 minutes is the end of a round, and you have 60 seconds sitting on your stool for the cut man to work on you. I don't think there's any of these in the clips, but you should probably try to watch some fights that has multiple rounds and watch what's happening in the time between rounds, because the cut man's working on them, and they used to take ice and work on the cuts and stuff like that. Now they have these they look like these little clear medical pads, but what it really is it's like cold, super cold, and they push this around. I mean, it looks like they're ironing them, when in reality it's like they freeze it in between, just to get that bleeding stopped just enough. And then meanwhile, the 2 trainers are serving as psychologists, talking in their ear, like, like one of them was, one of them's usually clearly, "You could do it, champ. You're the best." It's more that type of thing, and then the other one's giving strategy, like, "Oh, did you notice he's dipping his left hand? You get him on an over right cross. Stay out of the ropes." And it's just this frantic 60 seconds of trying to fix your fighter emotionally, fix them medically, and give them strategy all at once. It's kind of fascinating stuff. You know, I showed you clips. You read about Jack Johnson, and I've already talked a little bit about him. Joe Louis is the forgotten great heavyweight, and I think if you want to add, because Joe Louis was, Jackie Robinson bore the weight of the world on his shoulders, but you can also say the same thing about Jesse Owens. However, Joe Louis was really before Jesse Owens. He was a decade or plus before Jackie Robinson. And much like Jackie Robinson, but unlike Jesse Owens, Joe Louis was subjected to this for a great period of time. 10 years. Whereas Jesse Owens, the whole 1938 Olympics thing was just a few weeks. Now, yes, Jesse Owens fought racism after he came back and actually became kind of a sort of almost an anti-civil rights figure. Really lost a lot of reputation because he was very accommodationalist as an African American and sort of lost the respect of the African American community and a lot of other communities as well. But Joe Louis, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we look at Jackie Robinson and we put him absolutely on the pedestal, and he deserves to be on the pedestal. But if we make an accommodation, we put Jesse Owens up there with him. I think that all three of them should be up there, and Joe Louis is perpetually the forgotten man. Joe Louis was the African American boxer that came to prominence after Jack Johnson, a decade or two after Jack Johnson. He came during a time when Jim Crow was all the more pronounced because of the Great Depression and competition for jobs. Okay. Leading to increased anger against Black Americans. Because a lot of racism during that time period was being perpetuated by the fact that people were scared of wage undercutting and stuff like that. And if that weren't enough, his main competitor at one point was German during the Nazi era. Now, as it turns out, Max Schmeling was actually a decent guy and was very sort of against everything that the Nazis stood for, but people didn't know that at the time. In fact, Joe Louis and Max Schmeling became very, very good friends afterwards. Max Schmeling actually, I think he became like vice president of Pepsi Cola or something. But at the time, it became this titanic match in 1938 between a representative of a political ideology that viewed that Germanic peoples were at the very top of the pinnacle of perfection when it came to intellect and physical attributes and whatnot, and that people from Africa were at the very, very bottom. And so it became this kind of struggle. And it was also a struggle between fascism and democracy. Joe Louis, democratic United States, and, German fascist Nazi dictatorship. And he had lost to Schmeling the first time. He had lost to Schmeling, I think, when Schmeling was the world champ. But now they were fighting again, and Joe Louis was a little bit older and had come into his own. And you saw what happened. It didn't even last a round. It was over about as quickly as it began, and it was very, very difficult for Hitler to accept. Much like with Jesse Owens. He got like a double whammy between Jesse Owens and Joe Louis, demonstrating that no, and it was harder for him to explain away Joe Louis and for the Nazi propaganda machine, because Jesse Owens won in a 100-yard dash and the long jump. Sort of almost purely physical. I mean, yes, there's strategy, but there's a lot more strategy in boxing. Boxing does take strategy and tactics. It is not just about the physicality, but also the intellect of the fighter and the ability to switch tactics and very quickly, without much notice. And so it was harder for him to explain why Joe Louis was defeating Max Schmeling, and in particular why he was doing it in the first round of a match that was supposed to go 10 or 12 rounds. Okay, so that Joe Louis was so very important and just had a very hard road to walk because Jack Johnson just didn't care what people thought of him. Joe Louis, I've read accounts of him receiving mail from Black Americans all over and white Americans too, calling him things like a credit to his race. I mean, it's a very racist phrase that at the time people thought was a good phrase. But, he was basically, every move he made was scrutinized. He could not answer an insult with he was sort of in a difficult position, but he did it with class. He understood the pressures that were on him. He understood that even though it wasn't fair that his victories and successes would be linked to Black America, okay, completely unfair, but he understood that there was no way of getting around that, and I don't want to say embraced it, but did the best that he could with it. So I mean, and we just, no one ever talks about Joe Louis today. I mean, it's just so unfortunate, I think, but it really is that there were sort of, Jackie Robinson was going to eclipse a lot of things because it was baseball more popular than boxing. Rocky Marciano, some consider him one of the best of all time. He was at one point the only undefeated champion of all time until Floyd Mayweather also is now undefeated. Except for, unlike Floyd Mayweather, Rocky Marciano didn't duck all the good boxers until he knew he could win. Rocky Marciano was like, I'll take on anybody. And that punch that he threw that you saw that knocked out Jersey Joe Walcott, some people think it was the perfect punch ever thrown. I mean, it was so short, but it was so much power. And the other reason, so I show you for three reasons. Number one, because it's because I want to show you a clip of Rocky Marciano, one of the best fighters of all time, and also someone who helped continue to legitimize. We're going to be talking about Joe DiMaggio and how he helped legitimize Italian Americans before World War II. Rocky Marciano kind of continued that after World War II. So there's a sort of an ethnicity element to it as well. But, the second was for the punch. But the third, which you can hear, by the way, okay, you can hear the punch. I mean, it doesn't look like he hits him that hard, but, people at the time said it was the hardest punch they ever saw. And you saw how Jersey Joe Walcott, the other interesting thing about Rocky Marciano, he was only knocked down once in his entire career. He was 49-0, and of those 49 fights, he only hit the canvas one time and got back up and won. But I think it's a good example of the sort of brutal animalistic exaltation of the crowd. And here you have a man that's been hit to the point where he's unconscious, struck so hard with a padded glove that he loses consciousness, and the crowd is just almost in this animalistic uproar. I think, as you can tell, even though I'm very interested in the history of boxing, I'm not big on it. It is very violent from my perspective, but I do think that we do have these animalistic impulses in us when we watch sports. I mean, nothing makes you sit up in football like a big hit. Now today, versus 10 years ago when we didn't understand CTE. Maybe we're more aware of it, but I mean, I love Ronnie Lott. Okay, the hardest hitter in probably the history of. I mean, I think we all have our price, but I mean, there is something almost visceral and primal about boxing that leads normally buttoned down, you know, peaceful, you know, clear thinkers to all of a sudden get in an uproar and scream and yell and kind of almost let this inner thing out. And you see that as soon as he hits Jersey Joe Walcott, Rocky Marciano in that clip, they just kind of, I mean, it's almost like the crowd just roars to life. Muhammad Ali, you read the article about how he changed things, and we talked about it in class when we were talking about who's the greatest ever. For my money, it's Muhammad Ali. I think they say Joe Louis was a harder puncher, but I think, and Mike Tyson certainly was, but Muhammad Ali had three things really. Number one, he was quick. He was probably the quickest big man of all time. Number two, he had a will that could not be sort of beat. Now he lost, okay, so he would lose, but at the biggest moments when the chips were down and he was at the end of his rope, he kept going, whereas others would fold. He had a will bigger than anyone else, probably in the world of boxing. And number three, he outthought people. I mean, he changed his style. He could change it in the middle of a round. He could figure out what to do and when to do it and how to survive in the ring, and then how to sort of change tactics suddenly, catch somebody off guard and prevail. I mean, clearly, I think along with Jackie Robinson, easily on the Mount Rushmore of American sporting icons. I don't know who else I'd put 3 and 4. Maybe Babe Ruth. I'd have to think about number 4. But Muhammad Ali and Jackie Robinson have to be up there. Joe Louis probably fought a greater fight against racism, but Muhammad Ali still fought that fight too. And then if you add all the other things with Muhammad Ali, Nation of Islam, marketing, the Vietnam War, the fact he had to go, I mean, I think he's clearly one of the biggest, not just boxers, but sports icons. And then, of course, Iron Mike Tyson, who was sort of like a one-man wrecking crew, who, the only one that ever could beat him was himself. I mean, yes, I can't think of the guy's name now. Buster Douglas, ended up beating him, but it was only because Mike Tyson really hadn't trained and, was overweight and wasn't taking it seriously. I mean, if he'd been in shape, it wouldn't have been a contest. A couple other things I want to talk about. There are some other people we didn't talk about that I had you, see clips about or whatnot. One was Julio Cesar Chavez, and if you're wondering why him, because he's from Mexico, and this is a class in American sports and culture. It's because he was huge in American culture during the 1980s. When I was growing up. I remember hearing references to him and seeing him everywhere. And the reason why was, even though there were boxers, American boxers of Hispanic origin, probably earlier, more Puerto Rico, Cuba, more East Coast, Caribbean Hispanic. There had yet to, and even though there had been some Chicano boxing stars, there wasn't that one iconic giant presence in Chicano American boxing that would later become Oscar de la Hoya and others yet. Okay, and so the Chicana population of the American Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, really kind of latched on to Julio Cesar Chavez. And then he was so good. I mean, and I mean, I can't remember how many fights I mean, he just fought all the time, and didn't win all the time, but won almost all the time. But he was a big figure. He was a big figure to a community that was growing numerically, population wise, but also socially, economically, and politically. And eventually, his career faded, and Oscar De La Hoya, who was from Southern California, an American, um, rose. And I actually think he beat. Actually think they had a fight like right at the end of his career, right at the beginning of his career. But he was really, really big. I mean, he really was huge in Southern California when I was a kid. I mean, you saw his face all over the place. Even though he was from Mexico, he meant a lot to this community. And so that's why I included just a tiny little bit about him. The very sad thing of Patrick Day dying, and believe me, this is not something that's that uncommon. It doesn't happen all the time, but you don't have to go too long. Every couple of years you read about a boxer that dies. Okay, and the only reason I showed that one was because it was the only readily available one on YouTube that I could find. When people think about boxers dying in the ring, they tend to think it's heavyweights, and that's not correct, because heavyweights hit so hard that they can knock you out with one blow, and that's not what kills boxers. What kills boxers is repetitive snaps, where the brain's hitting the inside of the cranium. And so the people that die don't tend to die in the ring, and Patrick Day didn't die in the ring. They tend to get repetitive blows to the head, and to the point where, but not hard enough to knock them out. And so a lot of these fighters, like Patrick Day, that remind us that boxing is a very, very dangerous sport, and that perhaps it's outlived its usefulness. Um, that they're out on their feet. It's like their brain is telling them to get up and keep going, and they have this training, but they're at the point where they can't really defend themselves, but they look like they can, uh, and they just keep getting this repetitive hit to the head, and then usually it manifests itself in disorientation and nausea and vomiting and whatnot, and they tend to die at the hospital. Like the next day or later that night, usually hours later. Okay. Now this doesn't happen as much anymore. Okay. This used to happen with much more frequency because they're much more cognizant, the referees, as to what to look for. Okay. Uh, they're much more cognizant of understanding how physically and mentally concussions manifest themselves, and also how to avoid being tricked by the fighter when you ask him a question. Because at one point, and this was kind of like a standing joke, like, how many fingers am I holding up? I mean, you usually hold up 2 fingers. Okay, how many fingers am I holding up? And so what people were trained to say was 2. Okay, so that you could continue. If you're going to guess, you have, first of all, you have a 1 in 5 chance of guessing right. So guess 2. Okay. Well, that doesn't wash anymore. I mean, there's just how many fingers am I holding up is a decision whether or not you're going to continue and possibly die. They ask him questions that require a little bit more engagement. So it does still happen, but there's more of an ethic of trying to have the referees trained in such a way that they're a little bit quicker on the trigger finger to stop a fight. They'll stop it if they have any doubt whatsoever. Okay, and that's probably a good thing. Let's see, what else did I have you look at? Oh yeah, MMA. I thought I did assign a reading about MMA. MMA is interesting for several different reasons. Number one, it's even more bloodlust. Boxing's bad enough, but MMA, you get to see like joints come popping out, and talk about people bleeding and having their jaw broken, and MMA is so violent that they only schedule it for 5 rounds, and it rarely goes that long. You see people kicking people and their shin they break their shin and their foot just kind of flops around. I mean, it's pretty horrible stuff. I mean, there is an elegance and beauty to boxing. Uh, I'll admit, even though I'm not a big fan of boxing in the 21st century, I think it's a sport that's maybe outlived its life. Um, but MMA is like takes it to another level, man. And sometimes you see these people that just, I mean, just blood, but people love it. I mean, it's so popular. And I think, why is it popular? Why did it replace boxing? I think it's because it's more violent. I think because Dana White was very smart in how he marketed it. I do think that there was a I have. Well, I think it's because it's more violent. I wonder if at first MMA was more American, and I wonder if MMA started to rise when the Klitschko's, the Ukrainian boxers, who were very technical. I mean, they weren't that exciting as fighters. I wonder if there's a sort of a notion that boxing was getting too non-American, particularly the heavyweight, which is what the casual fans follow. So the casual fans started following MMA because it was Chuck Liddell and it was Tito Ortiz, and the American. Well, of course, what happens with MMA now is that it's very, very multinational. Now, there are some things that I think are very interesting about MMA, even though you can tell I'm not a big fan. I just think it's too violent. But it is a sport that's very much about globalization. It's called mixed martial arts, okay? And it's very much about taking things from China and the United States and Europe. I mean, it's taking different styles of wrestling and fighting and kind of putting them into one fighter. So that's kind of an interesting. I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing. It really is about the globalization of a sport into now. There's all these different things, fighting styles, including. The reason I put the Gracie in there was this was a Brazilian family, some of whom have now made it to the United States. I think Southern California actually, who took from Japan jiu-jitsu. And I'm not sure exactly when the time period was. I think it was like 30s, 40s, and 50s, and basically retranslated it, and then had the series of fights with Japanese practitioners who were kind of surprised that this form that had been developed in Japan had been sort of there for hundreds of years, all of a sudden had a new spin on it, and it was Elio Gracie, Brazilian man that did this. So I threw that in there. I thought that was interesting, and then of course the rise of female boxers and MMA fighters. Boxers not that popular. If I asked you to name a female boxer, I think you might struggle a little bit. I can only name a couple. The one that most people know is Layla Ali, mostly because of the fact that she's the daughter of Muhammad Ali. That's why most people can kind of name her. But it was very, very different in MMA. I mean, for a time there, the MMA female fighters were more, they were the main event. Ronda Rousey in particular, but also Cyborg and some other figures, Gina Carano. MMA is far more it's not gender equitable. There's still far more fights for men, and probably most men make more money on their fights than most women, unless you're a Ronda Rousey. But boxing has rarely featured female bouts. They exist. They've existed, for a very long time, but rarely are they highlighted or featured, and usually only when it's the daughter of Joe Frazier or Layla Ali. They actually fought each other, by the way, which was interesting. but MMA is very different, and so that's one thing that I think makes it kind of interesting. And I also threw that scene in there showing Ronda Rousey. The fact that no, a semi skilled person in soccer is not going to be able to beat Abby Wambach. No, a semi skilled a semi skilled male tennis player who's sort of mid-level is not going to be able to beat Serena Williams. And no, just because you're a white belt doesn't mean that you can do well against Ronda Rousey. She's going to throw you. I'm not sure why he picked a hardwood floor for that demonstration, but whatever. A couple of other things. I would try to keep these to an hour because I know you have an hour or so of reading and an hour of watching these clips that I have. I'll just, I do have 3 videos that I want to show, particularly since we're talking about violence in sport. But, just sort of through Gorn, I think it's interesting. He talks about the violence that's in both lower class and upper class sporting that came out of medieval England, particularly the British heritage. The hunting sports, fox hunting and stuff like that, killing things, killing pheasants, superiority of hand-eye coordination, was an upper class thing. And that the more he calls bloodlust sports like boxing were more lower class. I think he's making the point that it doesn't matter if you're, that the upper class find a way of sating their bloodlust. It's just not fighting each other. It's killing birds and what would a fox be? It's not a dog. A canine, I guess. That violence has always been a part of sport. Okay, and we get most of our spectator sports from the British, and the British have always had this kind of sort of violent streak in them. As it's not just the British; it's everyone. As I'll show you in just a second. I talked last week about the northern colonies. The more religious. It has to be productive Calvinist. The Calvinists were more suspicious of sports, so it was like wood shopping and stuff that you're that you're more doing it collaboratively. And yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a competition, but hey, at the end of the day, you have firewood. And then the Southern was more these, it was more about masculinity, the gander pole. And, I really think it's interesting where Gorin talks about in plantation life, it was hot, it was humid. And even though slaves, were expected to work all day long, the white plantation owners took breaks during the days. Almost siestas. It would be the word we would use today. So they had sort of this theory of sort of work and repose. And when you were repose is sort of like rest and relaxation. And when you did that, you did these games to demonstrate masculinity. I think it's also interesting that Gorin talks about how in slavery, in the North, you idolized work. You're a hard worker. Well, in the American South, that work was done by slaves. And the white culture then had a hard time idolizing work because they were lazy. Okay. Now, I'm not saying there weren't hardworking people, white Southerners, but, for the hardest work, they, had forced labor. So instead of idealizing work, they idealized recreation. Okay. And that's where, instead of proving your masculinity and your worth through hard work, as was happening in the North with the Puritans and Calvinists and whatnot, in the South, it was through these tests of feat, wrestling, boxing, horse riding, shooting, the gander pole. Uh, that's what was idealized as demonstrating masculinity and dominance. Okay. And then, of course, Warren talks about how really it was the middle colonies that kind of were more about mass spectacle, and slowly but surely a system developed in New York and Philadelphia and a few other places that is kind of morphed into what that we know today. Okay. Urban commercial spectacle is what he calls it on page 37, and I think that's he also talks about George Washington realizing that exercise and sports and camp, if you got a bunch of young guys and not a lot to do because they're trying to survive in Valley Forge when the British are for the winter or whatever. You want to keep people occupied, particularly young men. Okay, young men get into trouble if they're, it's the reason we want to have after school programs. All that testosterone floating around, probably not a good thing. So, you tire them out, and one way you do that is in the morning you drill and you have calisthenics, and they go on runs, and they I don't think they did push-ups and curls and whatever the 18th century version of that was. But George Washington realized the usefulness of this, and this helped them blow off steam. This helped them to kind of get that nervous tension and tire them out a little bit. It was sort of a smart thing that he was doing. Okay, it's already after 1 hour. And finally, I think George Washington, it's just the page after, page 44, but, the focus on useful sports, tree cutting, plowing, plowing competitions, hey, we get to see who's strong and quick. But we also planted a field of yams. So, hey, guess what? In a few months, we'll have yams. Okay. I do want to show you 3 clips. Okay. The first is Royal Shrove football. And this actually comes out of, I think I have a Wikipedia page for it also. Yes. Royal Shrovetide football. There's actually a whole bunch of others like this. This is just the most famous one, but this is a medieval quote-unquote football game, which is played in, I believe it's like March, April. It's around Easter. And basically what it is you get a ball, and it's played between people that live in this one town, or it's kind of a couple of little towns, and there's the upenders and downenders. Basically, the people that live on one side of the town and the people that live on the other side of the town, they play this game all day long for a couple days where you basically, everyone's in a crowd trying to get this ball to your opponent's goal. And you have to tap it on their goal 3 times. And essentially anything goes. And it was first played at least... they've been played since the 12th century, so that's coming up on 900 years. However, the one that's been the most famous one, the Ashbourne game, has been played since at least 1667. So we're talking about coming up on 350 years, folks. And there's very few rules, and the rules are, and I am not joking, I'm going to show you what the rules are. Committing murder or manslaughter is prohibited. It's good to know. Unnecessary violence is frowned upon. The ball may not be carried in a motorized vehicle. Well, that one was clearly added at some point. The ball may not be hidden in a bag, coat, or rucksack. It needs to be visible. Cemeteries, churches, and the town memorial gardens are strictly out of bounds. Playing after 10 p.m. is forbidden. To score a goal, the ball must be tapped 3 times in the area of the goal. Basically, this is an excuse for people to get drunk and rowdy. And if you think that this is crazy, which it is, go to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, which is also in the same time period. And if you start to wonder why a lot of these kind of nutty rituals, including one I'm going to show you in just a bit, are linked to the spring, it's because of all the, particularly when in in Europe, for farmers, there's not a lot to do during the winter. Okay, you stay indoors, you sharpen your tools, you try to get by, you try to survive to where you can plant your next crop. Okay, uh, it rains, it's cold. I've actually seen one of these rituals in Sweden, actually an end of summer ritual. But these rituals tend to be at the beginning of the sort of spring summer or at the end of the summer. Okay, and it's all about the one in Sweden, particularly. It was all about we're about to enter another 8 months of winter when like everything's snowbanks and this that and the other. So let's let it all hang out. Let's just go crazy. Okay, and this is what Royal Shrovetide is.
It's just mad, isn't it? It's just mad. It's just crazy.
I think there might be a little bit of swearing in here, so and there is a little bit of violence too.
First time I've ever been, so yeah, I'm a bit nervous.
Quite fierce, really, yeah, because I work with people as well who are uppers, and obviously we have a bit of banter. It's all good fun though. It is all good fun.
Yeah, nobody really gets injured, but there is rivalry, and they do sort of pump each other up. So before the game, or a few nights before the game, they really get pumped up and get onto it seriously, and they are out to win. Yeah.
Was in one of the pubs down there, the ball coming like in the doorway. I was like, ah! Crazy. Everyone was running past us. I thought, oh my God. Yeah, crazy. Brilliant.
The biscuit.
Okay, well, you get the idea. Let me show you another one that even takes out the that you didn't see any real fights there. It's just kind of violent. Well, let's now go to one that they play in Florence. Yes, the same Florence of the Renaissance that turned out the greatest art the world has ever seen. They do this once per year. It's called Calcio Storico Fiorentino, and we're seeing the Azure team, the Azzurri team, obviously the ones wearing blue, versus the Rose team. The one, all the teams. There's green, there's white, there's red, there's rose, there's yellow. All these teams you're about to see. So it's a different type of football than you are accustomed to seeing.
Sei in grado di fare un pronostico, Luis?
No, non lo voglio fare anche perché, come dicevo prima, le squadre si stanno un po' allineando in alto perché stanno giocando un bel calcio in costume e quindi vorrei vedere una bella partita come sicuramente sarà e come lo è stata quella di ieri. Io sto aspettando di far partire la classifica, il cronometro.
Non siamo così storici neanche noi. Vediamo intanto una linea di battuta molto agguerrita per entrambi i colori.
Un silenzio, senti, non si sente volare una mosca.
La tensione è altissima.
La tensione è veramente altissima, Attenzione al fischio d'inizio. Ecco, partito! E subito nella zona centrale del campo ci sono gli scontri che ormai fanno parte del calcio storico, questo affrontarsi testa a testa, e quindi si inizia subito così. La palla sono i rossi, la palla ce l'hanno i rossi,
lo schieramento si è subito perso.
ci sono subito queste sfide praticamente nella zona centrale del campo, dove c'è il battipalla degli
Okay. So, if you're wondering why American sports in the American colonies during the 1600s, 1700s, and after the United States became a nation in 1776, is so violent, it's because the colonies, which were founded by uh, not just British, but also from other European, were very violent themselves. Okay, so there's this long history of violence in sport, not just in England and France, but the whole world over. It's no surprise. Sometimes the violence is inflicted by a hill, and this is the famous Cooper. I think it's called Cooper's Hill or something. Cheese chasing competition in England. Okay, and much violence, although all of it. I don't know if you want to blame the hill or the stupid people that are chasing the cheese down the hill, but basically you just roll a wheel of cheese down a hill and everyone chases it, and it's a very steep hill. Okay, and you can see the piece of cheese. It's a wheel of cheese. It's over towards the right of the screen, and it's about to roll down the hill and out the right side of the frame.
Well, a police inspector came to visit us several months ago. They were concerned whether we were aware of the implications of supplying cheese to the cheese roll. If we knowingly supplied cheese for the cheese roll, we may be held liable for any claims resulting from injuries.
I'm used to defending it, but a bit more pressure on this year.
Okay, well, you get the idea. Okay, so I think that's week one, boxing, but also violence and other things that surrounding boxing, such as MMA, cheese rolling, things of that nature. So I look forward to our time in week two, where we get together and talk about violence in sports and boxing and other such issues.